Welcome, everyone, and greetings. So grateful for you to be with us today. My name is B.A. Medina. My pronouns are Z, here, and heres. I invite any of you to ask questions in our chat. Captions are enabled, and we also have a fabulous interpreter if you'd like to share for that. But I'd love to introduce Madelyn Toman, who will be presenting to you today narratives of personal health and sexual education experiences of emerging adults with disabilities. Madelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. My camera is turned on and I am a cis white woman. I'm sitting in a graduate student kitchen with several items behind me that you might expect to find. So like a poster and cleaner and a coffee maker. I want to just take a minute to acknowledge where I'm at today. I am proposing my dissertation in 2 weeks. And so for those of you familiar with spoon theory, I started the day with about half my spoons, and here we are. I'm extremely excited to be presenting this work today. And I hope that you all bear with me as my brain jumps from topic to topic. So the work I'm presenting to you today is actually my master's thesis work, and it was titled Narratives of Personal Health and Sexual Education Experiences of Emerging Adults with Disabilities. All of this work was done from basically summer of 2022 to summer of 2023. I defended that year, and this was published last September in the Journal of Sexuality and Disability. You can see on this screen, I've included the citation for all of you to find as easily as possible. Okay, just a basic outline for today's what I'm going through. I'm gonna just set up the study for you, basically show you the flow and the logic that brought me to the purpose and the research question. I'll describe my sample and the methods that I used, the overall findings, and then run through my discussion and implications. And hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. 2 things I wanted to note before I move forward. I intentionally use person first and identity first language throughout both my manuscript and throughout all of my presentations to honor the life experiences of all of my participants. I recognize that language matters and all of us have our thumb on the pulse of what language we prefer while respecting everyone else's opinions and choices. However, I had participants use an array of identities and language and have different preferences. So I felt it best honored my entire sample to include both. Throughout this presentation, I also use PHSE, which is just my personal shorthand for personal health and sexual education. So let's get started. A brief introduction and background to this study. As most of us know, probably more commonly than other academics outside of our fields, the disabled communities and populations largely have experienced historical mistreatment and sexual marginalization and dehumanization. This has happened in the forms of forced sterilization, ideas and beliefs rooted in ableism and the eugenics movement, and continued infantilization of different disabled communities globally. In the United States, this has led to students with disabilities during youth, adolescence, and even into adulthood not receiving proper PHSE in school systems and in formal settings. Even though a majority of states in the United States require some form of sexual education, and I believe it's 9 of those now require comprehensive sexual education, most students with disabilities are not included in these classrooms, which is an overlooked violation of the IDEA Act that guarantees disabled students the rights to appropriate education for free. And we also see that informal sources of educators like family and other caregivers and medical providers are typically unequipped to provide people with different disabilities about ways that their disabilities and sexualities may influence one another over the lifespan. We see many consequences because of this inadequate education, including increased victimization in youth and adolescents, especially with diverse disabilities, a higher rate of STIs and unplanned pregnancy across the United States for minors with disabilities, and internalized ableism, consistently due to not seeing sexual messaging with people who look like us and talk like us and think like us. And we still see to this day, there are a lot of barriers to disabled communities receiving types of education, like this historical mistreatment, consistent oppression of disabled voices in research, and that includes not including disabled participants in studies about disabilities. And instead taking words from their healthcare providers and families to represent their experiences. And because of all of these, I chose to focus this study on, ooh, I lost my mouse. I chose to investigate the lived experiences and journeys of different emerging adults in the United States and how they learned about personal health and sex education. Now, my sample, I chose to include multiple representations of disabilities because although some sex education research for individuals with disabilities is really focusing on and narrowing communities, I wanted to expand and I wanted to get a breadth of experience so I could tell stories of how people with different disabilities are having shared experiences, but then also unique experiences to them. You can see my guiding research questions here as well. So I recruited around a university town. I'm at Virginia Tech. I recruited around our town for both in university and out of university groups with disabled representation and identity. And my inclusion criteria, it's very important to me. I do not think that everyone with a disability has a diagnosis. I believe in disability identity being the most important inclusion criteria for a disability study. And so my final sample had 8 participants with a mean age of 21.5. A majority were Caucasian and they were all students. Below you can see a list of all of the different disability identities that my participants had. And I want to point out how there are more disabilities on this list than I had participants. And it was exciting, expected. I was happy to see the comorbid disabilities. So everyone who participated in my sample identified with at least one, but mostly more than one disability on this list. So you can see the number as well. For my study, I used narrative methodology, which is the type of qualitative methodology. One of the exciting things about using narrative methodology is that what you're asking your participants to do is tell their story. And then me as the researcher, I serve as kind of a facilitator during the interview, but then really importantly, I help make in the moment interpretations that they can either correct or agree with to make sure that I am interpreting their story correctly. And I guided each interview differently. So every interview started with this basic question. Tell me your story. Tell me your story about how you learned personal health and sexual education. Who were the key individuals, so characters in your story who taught you, who didn't teach you, who might have failed you? And then how did this change over time based on your experiences? After this question, every interview got extremely unique, which is where I turned to my probing questions. I was vigorously taking notes while trying to active listen to every story. And all of the questions that followed this first were specific to the individual's experiences. That way, I wasn't placing my own biased opinions on what I thought they were trying to say or what I thought they had experienced. And it was really true to them. that's why I not only chose this methodology, but I recognize this as such a powerful method when doing disability research. Oh, I apologize. Can you still see my screens?
Yes, I can. You're
Sorry.
good.
So I'm going to go through my findings really quickly. I want to make the note that I did not provide individual quotes throughout these slides because I have a tendency to ramble and I wanted to take time for everyone to ask questions at the end if you wanted to. But again, you can find the link to my manuscript in these slides. And I really encourage you to read stories because my participants just had they wanted to share, and it was so much fun to listen. And then to describe. So I found 4 story types with this work. The first, I labeled the self-guided journey, which is exactly what it sounds like. 3 different participants described experiencing a failure of formal personal health educators. Some mixed parental guidance. So some parents were able to provide information, some were not. This specific story type just really highlighted the failure of medical providers who provided them diagnoses to also give them information about their sexuality development and ways that their disability will influence over time. And so these individuals actively had to seek out their own education, and that's what brought them to their knowledge that they had at the time of the interview. The next story type I found, which was also experienced by 3 participants, was experience is the best teacher. And I describe this as using hindsight. So what I mean by that is these individuals were also receiving unhelpful school education and had very reactive discussions from their families. So their families weren't intending to teach them about their own sexualities, but after experiences, their families needed to inform what they had experienced. And so they had a lot of vicarious learning through others, but these individuals really learned from their own personal experiences and then made meaning and made sense of, oh, this is how my disability showed up in my first sexual encounter. This is how it could in the next. And then we also saw an influence of media in this story as well. My third story type, which I called personal health matters more, represented one individual's experiences. And for Cecilia, she really didn't receive any sex education, but that's because it wasn't a priority for her. She wasn't seeking it out. She was diagnosed very, very young with multiple disabilities that she wanted to prioritize her health over any sexual experiences with others, even the day that I met her. And so she learned over time how to personally advocate for herself to receive personal health information, although she never asked questions or was taught about um, sexual education or ways that her disability will influence her sexuality over time. And then the final story type was named after an in vivo code, which means it was literally his words, 2 ears and 1 mouth. My final participant explained to me how dating and sex were not anywhere near his priorities. He had an extremely supportive family that did teach him about sexuality if he had questions, or if they wanted to, but he wasn't asking those questions. He was absorbing everything like a sponge because he didn't need to know, but he was receiving the information anyways. Although some of the information he was receiving, like in school, was abstinence education. And he has peers with similar values, so they were experiencing the same things. So some of the things that I bring up in my discussion for this paper are really how formal sources of personal health and sex education are often inaccurate and inadequate for youth and adolescents who are going through important sexual transitions while having disability characteristics. Sometimes informal supports are giving helpful advice and helpful influence, but sometimes they're not. And what's really being failed to recognize is that disability symptoms and then personal characteristics overall contribute to when people want to learn about sex and health education. And they're also informing the types of education that they're receiving. I apologize. Timing matters. And really, disability, sexuality, and then disabled sexuality is a non-linear experience that not everyone's experiencing the same. So it's not a copy and paste model. What I really drew this out to mean is sexuality development is not linear, regardless if you have a disability or not. And this follows some past research. We have to reject a one size fits all model and recognize the individuality and the personal implications that are in sexuality development. Um, One way to effectively do this is to incorporate universal design into formal personal health and sex education. And by that, I mean both in schools and from medical providers. Because oftentimes, medical providers, especially those who provide diagnoses, are the first point of contact for individuals to learn about their disabilities. And so, if we can also equip medical providers with just a plethora of diverse experiences about what disabilities can influence sexuality development, well, then they can pass that on to youth who might experience it, and they can really hone in on the like rejecting ableism in larger societal narratives about how sexuality should look and how it should be explored. And then also having reliable media sources to serve as tools for individuals to find their own education when they want it. It's very important as well. I want to mention that there are limitations to my study. Although narrative methodology allows me to really dive into and invest the complexities of individual experience, it has to be a small sample size because I also have to graduate on time. And when we only have so much funding. But my sample was mostly white and it was mostly comprised of women. It also did not include any participants with any IDD or who were non-mainstream individuals. So I list these as opportunities for future researchers and really exciting ways to narrow in on this wider study. And then here are just some key takeaways to the presentation. I know I'm wrapping up on time and I apologize for that, but I want to make sure everyone walks away, as we all know, but really what this research proves, that inclusive universal design public sexual health matters, and diversity and disability existence matters when we are talking about the larger constructs of how to educate mass communities. So that's the end.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Grateful for you and your presentation. Welcome, folks, to be able to share some questions in the chat. As you do so, as you think about that, I wanted to share at least a starter question for you, Madeline. I'll read aloud and also have in the chat. So thank you for describing how your research participants could have benefited from more personal and sexual health education, PSHE, as disabled folks. However, given the attack on sexual health teaching more broadly, how might you advise attendees to advocate for PSHE changes despite the barriers we might encounter? I know you talked about universal design, but maybe how to implement that, especially with the precarious political and sociopolitical environments.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. And I would almost advise to really go to those informal educators, because we're seeing in our political climate in the United States today, there's this push for families to be the ones who teach individuals about sexuality. But if you aren't teaching families how to teach people, then what's going on? We all roll our eyes to this, I understand. I think my first point of advice would be to form a caregiving team, or an information team that could include schools, but really hones in on families, peers, medical providers, and other caregivers, just to give as much information to individuals when they are ready to receive it and when they're asking those questions, and not serve as gatekeepers who want to impose their own values onto individuals. Yeah. Does that answer your question fully?
It absolutely does. Thank you. Another thing that follows up from that, Madeline, as you're describing, the reliance upon not just peers or friends or family that might be able to inform, but how might you mitigate folks who maybe misinform, or maybe they themselves have unreliable sources of some of this information? I don't want to disparage social media can be beautiful and it can also have its downside. So I wonder how you would mitigate some of the harms that could happen from folks more informally sharing maybe misinformation or disinformation in that way.
Yeah. I want to actually refer to one of my participant stories. One participant who fell into the first story type, oh my gosh, the self-guided journey. I almost forgot my own study. um, she received improper advice from a medical provider about how one of her diagnoses interacted with a form of birth control that she was using. And it was really harmful for her because what they said was, oh, yeah, everyone with diabetes that I serve has this kind of pregnancy prevention. But then she was having all these negative bodily and like internal feelings, and then it was showing up in her everyday life. So she went on some Reddit outlet for her specific diagnoses, overlapping comorbid diagnoses, and she read stories about people who are like, oh, don't listen when they tell you this because I had this experience. And she described she's found community regardless if they were educators or professionals to give that advice. She found people who had similar life experience to her. So while acknowledging that not all social media or just internet groups are formal educators, have any professional means or things, credentials that they can provide individuals, recognizing that personal lived experience is just as, if not more important. I think that internet groups can serve as mutual educators that take down these larger systematic advice that don't really know what they're talking about.
I love your example, Madeline, and thank you for illustrating further how even those who are perceived as experts in a field may get it wrong and actually may cause greater harm, and that it was a larger community online that may be able to mitigate that harm because they provide some of their own lived experiences. The vulnerability online allowed for your participant, it sounds like, to really be heard and valued and actually know a bit of information that they wouldn't have otherwise if they relied solely on their practitioner that they were working with. I wanted to give, we have a couple of minutes left. If there are any questions that folks want to share in the chat, we may have room for one more question. But as folks are maybe generating that, I'd love, Madeline, as you're navigating this in your own body and your own experiences, obviously doing the study and for your thesis, how is the impact of their sharing on you?
Oh, I it has to be because I'm also a researcher, but I love talking to people about ways that sexualities and disabilities interact because I have in-group membership. I have my own biases and experiences about how my invisible disabilities has show up so widely across my sexuality development. But really, all this work I did, their stories, their voices, led me more towards sexuality, disabled sexuality identity development, and that's what my dissertation's actually focusing on. And so it's really inspiring future work that's taking me away from education, but more to identity development.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Building upon one another and for your dissertation, I would imagine that folks can then build off of that and kind of continue to contribute in ways that would be profound. So thank you. I think we're getting close to time. You're hearing, I don't know if you've seen the chat, there's lots of praise, lots of resources that are being shared. Just great gratitude for you, Madeline, for this presentation. And folks are excited to see more of your work as it develops. Amazing presentations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you one and all for joining us this afternoon or wherever you are around the world. Wanted to very much appreciate you for being attending to this session. Thanks again, Madeline. Have a lovely rest of your day, everyone.